Forget everything you think you know about the Wild West saloon from flickering Hollywood images. Erase those scenes of cowboys cheerfully tucking into platters piled high with sizzling steaks, fluffy golden cornbread, and perfectly brewed coffee. The romanticized picture of hearty, wholesome fare served with a smile behind those iconic swinging doors. That's mostly a comforting lie. The culinary reality for the average cowboy, miner, or drifter was often far more grim. A daily gamble with their digestion, and sometimes even their very survival. What horrors, and indeed, what occasional surprising delights, truly awaited a soul brave enough to seek sustenance in these dusty, boisterous establishments. Prepare yourself, because this journey into the stomach of the Old West might just turn yours. If you were fortunate enough to stumble into a saloon before the sun reached its zenith, preferably in a state of relative sobriety and not actively bleeding from a recent altercation, you might, just might, have been offered the prospect of eggs and chicken. And if such an offer was indeed extended, you knew you were either in the presence of a minor miracle, a sign of a truly upscale establishment, or potentially walking into a cleverly disguised culinary trap. Let's begin with the eggs. Fresh eggs in the Wild West were akin to gold. Not actual glittering gold, of course, but nearly as rare, equally fragile, and highly prized. Chickens were not typically raised for mere amusement on the frontier. They were cantankerous, prone to wandering off into the wilderness, and frequently fell victim to theft, predation by foxes or coyotes, or simply ended up in someone's stew pot without prior authorization. If a saloon actually had eggs on hand, it meant one of several things. They either maintained their own flock of somewhat cooperative chickens nearby, had a reliable and probably well-compensated local supplier, or were engaged in a clandestine high-stakes smuggling operation to procure eggs from the next town over. As for the type of eggs you might receive, hopefully they were chicken eggs. Possibly they were duck eggs. On rare occasions, they might have been something else entirely, perhaps laid by a bird of more mysterious lineage. You quickly learned that it was generally wiser not to ask too many probing questions about their origin. You ordered eggs, and what arrived on your plate depended entirely on the cook's mood that morning, the prevailing atmospheric conditions, and most critically, the actual age of the egg itself. Some were prudently scrambled, a common tactic to disguise any slight imperfections in color or freshness. Others were fried until the yolks solidified into a leathery, unyielding disc. And if an egg, once delivered to your table, exhibited a suspicious wobble or an unsettling translucence, that was generally considered a clear sign from the universe to politely decline and order a large whiskey instead. As for chicken, it did occasionally appear on saloon menus, but not with any great frequency or reliability. If the menu optimistically proclaimed fried chicken, what you'd most likely receive was a portion of a rather scrawny, sinewy bird that had clearly died angry and full of resentment. It would be tough, undeniably bony, and invariably fried in a generous amount of lard until any subtle flavor the chicken might have once possessed had completely tapped out and surrendered. Consuming such chicken wasn't always worth the considerable effort of chewing. But it was undeniably meat. It was usually served hot, and most importantly, it wasn't beans again. So weary folks often ate it with a degree of stoic gratitude. You might get a single drumstick roughly the size of your thumb, or perhaps a quarter of the bird, roasted somewhat haphazardly over an open flame. You might also, as an unintended bonus, discover a stray feather still clinging to your gravy, and that was simply considered part of the rustic charm of frontier dining. Breakfast offerings that included both eggs and chicken were a significant status symbol for saloons. Such a menu boldly declared, "We possess food that didn't originate in a can or a barrel. We are a cut above." If the eggs were served warm and the chicken wasn't unpalatably dry, you'd eagerly recount this culinary triumph to your buddies for weeks to come. And if, on the unfortunate other hand, it ended up giving you a severe case of food poisoning, well, that was just the Wild West's unsubtle way of reminding you exactly who was in charge. Still, there was something inherently hopeful about ordering eggs in a saloon. They signified morning, a new day, and the simple fact of survival. And just maybe, if you were lucky, they meant you'd live to order another drink and perhaps even another meal by nightfall. In the rough and tumble, often utilitarian environment of a Wild West saloon, pie was more than just a simple dessert. It was a statement. It was a beacon of culinary effort in a landscape often dominated by bean slop and overcooked pork. If you walked into a saloon and saw a pie, or several pies, sitting proudly on the bar or a nearby counter, perhaps with a hint of steam still rising from a freshly cut slice, its crust a promising golden brown, the sweet scent of baked apples or berries managing to cut through the prevailing haze of smoke and whiskey, you knew this particular establishment meant business. You also knew, with a fair degree of certainty, that someone in that kitchen, likely the overworked and underappreciated cook, had actually put in some real, tangible effort. And that level of dedication, in a land where expediency often trumped quality, was practically a love letter written in pastry. Now don't let your imagination get too far ahead of itself. Pie in the Wild West wasn't typically a delicate, intricately lattice-topped pastry masterpiece, brimming with perfectly ripe, farm-fresh fruit. It was more often than not a rather rough, decidedly rustic affair. Expect uneven, perhaps slightly scorched crusts, fillings made from canned or dried fruit that had been laboriously rehydrated, and it was usually served lukewarm at best, or even cold. Whipped cream. Not unless a particularly obliging cow had miraculously followed you into town and was willing to be milked on demand. The most common varieties were apple, usually from dried apples reconstituted, peach, from canned peaches if they were lucky, or berry pie. Berry was often a wonderfully flexible and somewhat ambiguous category that sometimes included raisins masquerading as berries or other dried fruits that only vaguely resembled their fresh counterparts after a long soak and a generous dose of sugar. If the cook possessed a notably sweet tooth or was feeling particularly generous, you might get a welcome dash of cinnamon or nutmeg in the filling. If not, you essentially got crust, sweetened fruit mush, and a healthy serving of optimism. Still, despite these rustic realities, pie was considered a rare and highly coveted treat. Most cowboys, miners, and trailhands hadn't laid eyes on a decent slice of pie since they left their homes and families far behind. And savvy saloon keepers knew that offering pie, especially a reasonably good one, gave them a significant competitive edge over establishments that only offered beans and whiskey. A truly good slice of pie, warm and flaky with a sweet, satisfying filling, could pull in customers from 2 towns over, men willing to ride extra miles for that small taste of comfort and nostalgia. And if the pie was exceptionally warm, particularly flaky, and the filling especially delicious, you can bet your last dollar that someone, somewhere, would eventually threaten to shoot someone else over the last remaining piece. There are indeed recorded stories, and a few undoubtedly exaggerated legends, of poker games that ended not in disputes over cheating at cards, but in heated, potentially violent arguments over who had the right to claim the final slice of apple or berry pie. You took the last DMN slice was considered as valid an offense and as legitimate a reason for drawing a weapon as accusing someone of dealing from the bottom of the deck. In a world where men had been stabbed, shot, or bludgeoned over a spilled glass of whiskey or a perceived insult, pie, in its own humble way, was practically sacred. Of course, not all saloon pies were created equal. Some were disappointingly mostly crust, with a thin, apologetic layer of filling. Some were clearly experimental, the result of a cook with too much time and too few reliable ingredients. And some had fillings that hinted, rather vaguely, at having been actual fruit at some point in a distant previous life. But if the stars aligned, if the cook was sober and feeling inspired, if the oven was cooperative and hot, and if the fruit used wasn't actively fermenting, then that slice of saloon pie was something to be truly cherished and remembered. Because in the pervasive dust and relentless grit of the American frontier, a simple slice of pie wasn't just food. It was hope, served warm on a battered tin plate. Cheese in the Wild West was a lot like a high-stakes poker game, full of inherent risk, requiring a certain amount of bluffing and bravado, and carrying a strong statistical probability that you deeply regret your choices the following morning. It did exist, yes, but its presence was sporadic and often questionable. You had to know where to look or who to ask, and even then, you had to be brave. Very brave. Because cheese in the 19th century American frontier wasn't typically shipped in neat, tidy wheels, lovingly wrapped in protective wax paper and kept under ideal temperature conditions. More often, it was made locally, frequently by someone whose primary qualification was that they once briefly read an article about dairy fermentation, possibly while under the influence. Most saloon cheese, when it made in rare appearance, came in one of two primary varieties, either hard, vaguely yellow, and suspiciously sweaty, or soft, undeniably crumbly, and possessing a slightly aggressive, challenging aroma that could clear a small room. Refrigeration, that marvel of modern food preservation, was a distant dream, a luxury enjoyed by very few. So, unless it was a particularly frigid month of the year, or the saloon happened to be conveniently located near an ice house or a naturally cool cave, chances were high that your cheese had been sitting out, slowly but surely developing its own unique and often formidable personality. It might have aspired to be cheddar. It might have harbored vague, unfulfilled ambitions of being something loosely Swiss. Or more commonly, it might just have been an unidentifiable lump of dairy guesswork, heavily salted and perhaps rolled in pepper to distract from its other, more alarming qualities. If it squeaked audibly when you bit into it, well, that was a private matter between you, your jaw, and your dental health. Cheese was usually served in rather unceremonious chunks, often alongside a hunk of equally hearty bread, a few slices of dried jerky, or, if you were exceptionally lucky and the saloon was feeling generous, a solitary, vinegary pickle. Its primary role was to help balance out the overwhelming saltiness that characterized so much of the other food on offer, and to provide cowboys with a much-needed protein boost between prolonged bouts of drinking and occasional brawls. You could even, with a bit of persuasion and a cooperative cook, get it melted over your beans or toasted onto a piece of cornbread, assuming the cook was feeling particularly artistic or indulgent that day. But beware, for some saloons were not above cutting corners, especially when it came to dairy. The cheese on offer might, in reality, be old butter that had gone tragically wrong, or perhaps curdled milk that had been hopefully pressed into a bar shape and then liberally dusted with cayenne pepper in a desperate attempt to distract your taste buds. One weary traveling merchant of the era once famously recounted purchasing a piece of cheese in a Nevada saloon that, in his vivid description, tasted like a boiled sock with a particularly stubborn rind. He still, heroically, ate the entire thing, because even truly awful cheese was, fundamentally, still cheese. And in the harsh culinary landscape of the Wild West, a saloon that offered any cheese at all, regardless of its dubious provenance or alarming aroma, stood out from the crowd. It signaled that the owner had valuable connections, perhaps to a local farm with a dairy cow, or at least access to a cow that hadn't yet been rustled or succumbed to prairie fever. Offering cheese wasn't primarily about providing exquisite flavor. It was a flex, a clear symbol of a certain level of civilization and prosperity, in a place where many people still considered bathing with sand a perfectly acceptable hygiene practice. So, if a saloon plate arrived before you bearing a slice of cheese, you'd eye it carefully, perhaps sniff it with cautious apprehension, maybe even tap it tentatively with your fork, and then, inevitably, you'd eat it anyway. Because in the West, taking a gamble was simply part of the dinner experience. If a food item could be successfully submerged in a pungent bath of vinegar and then largely forgotten in a dusty glass jar for an extended period, chances are extremely high that it was served, at some point, in a Wild West saloon. Pickling wasn't merely a flavor choice or a culinary preference on the frontier. It was a crucial, non-negotiable survival strategy. In the long, hot era before the widespread availability of refrigeration, saloon kitchens relied heavily on the preserving power of brine and the aggressive sourness of vinegar to keep food from spoiling, fermenting, or worse, actively crawling off the shelf and making a break for freedom. Vegetables, eggs, fruit, and even on occasion, meat. Practically nothing was safe from the transformative, life-extending embrace of vinegar. And that, in a nutshell, is how we ended up with the ubiquitous phenomenon of pickled everything. Pickled cucumbers, the absolute classic, were a mainstay. Ideally, they were crunchy, refreshingly sharp, and a vibrant, reassuring green. They were served as a simple side dish, used as a bracing chaser to cut the burn of cheap whiskey, or just offered as something to idly chew on between making a series of progressively bad decisions at the poker table. If you were lucky, they were made relatively fresh, perhaps with a bit of garlic and spice thrown into the brine for extra character. If you weren't so lucky, they tasted mostly of regret, diluted vinegar, and faintly of rainwater. Then there were the pickled eggs, an undeniable saloon staple, and an icon of questionable bar snacks. You'd see them, pale and ghostly, floating ominously in cloudy, murky jars arrayed behind the bar, usually positioned strategically near the whiskey bottles. They often looked like disembodied, spectral eyeballs and possessed a texture that many described, uncharitably, as akin to sadness. Some hardened cowboys swore by them, touting them as a quick, convenient shot of protein, easy to store, and most importantly, they mostly stayed down. Others, with equal vehemence, simply swore at them. Pickled onions were also common, particularly in rough and tumble mining towns. These were intensely sharp, fiercely tangy, and possessed a pungency strong enough to effectively chase off unwanted conversation, or even, some claimed, a small herd of buffalo. One bite, and you could confidently talk downwind of a stampede without fear of offending anyone further. Even pickled peaches or pears might make a surprising appearance on the saloon counter. In these instances, dried fruit was typically soaked in a sweet, vinegary brine to create a dish that was both culinarily confusing and, for some, strangely addictive. It wasn't quite dessert, and it certainly wasn't part of dinner. It was just a peculiar offering of wet, vinegary optimism in a jar. The true beauty of pickled goods, from a saloon keeper's perspective, was their astonishing shelf life. A saloon could keep jars of pickled items around for months, sometimes even years, without significant worry about spoilage. And in a place where fresh meat went bad faster than a poorly dealt poker hand, that kind of longevity was invaluable. But let's be brutally honest. Not all pickled items were created equal or even safe. Sometimes the jars weren't sealed correctly, leading to unsettling science experiments within. Sometimes the cook, perhaps emboldened by whiskey, decided to experiment with unconventional ingredients or brines. And sometimes, the pickled things just stared back at you from their murky depths with a disquieting, almost accusatory gaze. There are persistent tales, possibly exaggerated but too vivid to dismiss entirely, of men biting into what they believed to be pickled sausages, only to find unexpected bones, or perhaps a small handwritten label at the bottom of the jar that simply and ominously read, "Maybe pork." Still, despite the risks and the often challenging flavors, pickled foods were an integral, inescapable part of the Wild West saloon experience. They were salty, they were sour, and in their own peculiar way, strangely satisfying, much like everything else that managed to last out there on the harsh frontier. You didn't usually eat them for pure pleasure. You ate them because they probably, just probably, wouldn't kill you. When the food supplies inevitably ran scarce, when the saloon kitchen was declared closed for the night, or perhaps due to a rat infestation, or when the communal stew pot looked like it still possessed a faint, unsettling pulse, cowboys, drifters, and down-on-their-luck prospectors alike turned to the single most dependable, universally available item on any saloon menu: whiskey. It was always there, a steadfast, liquid companion. It required absolutely no preparation from the overworked cook, and, if you managed to drink enough of it, you often conveniently forgot that you were desperately hungry. Or perhaps more mercifully, you forgot that you just reluctantly consumed a bowl of highly questionable squirrel mystery meat. Whiskey in the Wild West wasn't the smooth, patiently aged, oak-barreled elixir curated by discerning connoisseurs that we might imagine today. Oh no. This was rough, raw, and frequently dangerous stuff. It was typically made from whatever grain was cheapest and most readily available: corn, rye, or sometimes a bewildering mixture of agricultural leftovers that the barkeep had managed to acquire. It was often distilled in makeshift operations hidden in back rooms, remote barns, or even, legend has it, in repurposed bathtubs. The resulting beverage was a fiery, potent liquid that could, anecdotally, clean stubborn wounds, strip old paint from furniture, and reliably fuel a prolonged and energetic fistfight. Some drinkers affectionately, or perhaps fearfully, called it rot gut. Others referred to it as chain lightning for its immediate and powerful impact. A pragmatic few simply and accurately referred to it as lunch. When the beans were irrevocably burnt to the bottom of the pot and the last loaf of bread had succumbed to a vibrant green mold, men often drank their daily calories, one searing, throat-burning shot at a time. Saloon whiskey wasn't just a simple drink. It was a multi-purpose survival tool. It helped to numb the chronic pain of trail dust in the lungs, the ache of a broken heart, the throbbing of recently acquired broken ribs, and, perhaps most importantly, the lingering, dubious aftertaste of that highly questionable stew. It was medicinal, in its own brutal way. One shot for courage before a tense duel, 2 shots to celebrate surviving it, or to mourn a fallen comrade. and maybe 3 or 4 more while you anxiously waited to see if that bullet wound you'd just sustained was, in fact, serious. It was common practice for saloons to offer whiskey specials, which often came with a token side of beans or a single lonely biscuit, not primarily for added flavor or nutritional balance, but more as a perfunctory attempt to keep the patron upright on his stool for a little longer. Some particularly hardy or desperate men were known to order their whiskey with a pickled egg dropped into the glass, a peculiar concoction that somehow managed to count as both hydration and a meager source of protein. And of course, whiskey was the indispensable social glue of the frontier. You bought rounds to make new friends, you shared it to seal a deal, you used it to instigate fights, and occasionally, you offered it as a liquid apology after both of those activities had concluded. You could often measure a saloon's rough and tumble reputation by how quickly its house whiskey could knock an unsuspecting man clean off his stool. Quality? Don't even bother asking. Some whiskey served was barely more than crudely colored and flavored moonshine. The list of potential additives ranged from the relatively benign molasses for color to the truly alarming tobacco juice for character, cayenne pepper for kick. It burned ferociously going down, and if by some miracle it didn't, you were probably, and unfortunately, drinking kerosene by mistake. Still, few complained loudly, because whiskey was reliably warm, usually cheap, and, in its own way, brutally honest. It was perhaps the only thing on the saloon menu that never lied about what it truly was. And on those long, lonely nights when your entire meal came served in a glass, with no fork required and absolutely no judgment offered, you raised it high, toasted your bleak circumstances, and pragmatically called it dinner. In any Wild West saloon that dared to venture beyond serving just liquor and actually offer food, there existed a shadowy, often smoke-covered, and invariably irritable figure whose power and influence rivaled that of the bartender, the local sheriff, and even the town preacher combined. The cook. This individual, frequently unshaven, perpetually clad in a soot-stained apron, and radiating an aura of general displeasure with the world, was either a life-saving culinary genius capable of conjuring sustenance from the bleakest of ingredients, or a veritable culinary war criminal whose concoctions could induce days of gastrointestinal trauma. There was rarely any middle ground. You'd almost never see them crack a smile, but you would undoubtedly remember their cooking for days, sometimes weeks to come, either with profound gratitude for a surprisingly edible meal, or with vivid, nightmarish flashbacks of digestive distress. Saloon cooks were not, as a rule, formally trained chefs from esteemed culinary academies. They were typically ex-miners whose lungs had given out, ex-convicts looking for a somewhat legitimate way to stay out of trouble, or ex-somethings or others who possessed the basic knowledge of how to build and maintain a fire, and, crucially, weren't overly squeamish about handling questionable cuts of meat. Their kitchen was often a testament to improvisation and endurance. A smoky fire pit in a lean-to out back, perhaps a dented wood-burning stove that threatened to collapse at any moment, and, almost invariably, a single massive cast iron pan that looked like it hadn't been properly washed since the height of the gold rush, seasoned instead by layers of history and countless meals. And yet somehow, from these primitive and often unhygienic setups, they managed to feed entire saloons full of hungry, demanding, and frequently intoxicated men. On a good day, a truly good day, they'd whip up a pot of chili so flavorful and hearty, it could bring a grown man to tears. In a good way, for once. The biscuits would emerge from the fire warm, flaky, and golden. The beans would be cooked through to a tender consistency, and the cornbread might even be just sweet enough to evoke a fleeting, nostalgic memory of home. But on a bad day, and bad days were regrettably common, the beans would be scorched to an inedible black crisp. The meat in the stew would be an unsettling shade of gray, glistening with an oily sheen that moved independently even when the pot was still. You didn't complain. You couldn't. Saloon etiquette, though largely unwritten, was crystal clear on this point. Never, ever insult the cook. Because the cook controlled everything that mattered. The amount of salt, or lack thereof, the quantity of grease, the crucial mystery meat to bean ratio in the stew. If they liked you, or at least didn't actively despise you, you might get the freshest cut of meat, the warmest biscuit, or an extra ladle of the less suspicious stew. If not, you were condemned to receive the burnt scrapings from the bottom of last night's culinary disaster, perhaps reheated and optimistically rebranded as chili surprise. These cooks also often doubled as the saloon's unofficial and highly effective bouncer. Nobody in their right mind wanted to get on the wrong side of a man, or occasionally a formidable woman, wielding a heavy iron ladle that had just survived the inferno of frying salt pork. And if the cook happened to possess a meat cleaver, which many did for practical and perhaps intimidating purposes, they could clear a room faster than a loaded shotgun. Despite their often surly moods and the variable quality of their output, these saloon cooks were absolutely vital to the functioning of the frontier. They kept cowboys on their feet during long cattle drives, miners from collapsing from exhaustion in the diggings, and weary travelers from expiring mid-sentence from starvation. They worked incredibly long hours in oppressive heat and choking smoke, endured constant, though usually unspoken, insults about their seasoning, and lived by a single, unwavering rule. If you don't like it, there's the door, or there's always more whiskey. So whether they were your culinary savior for the day or the saboteur of your digestive peace, you always nodded respectfully to the cook. Because in the Wild West, they held your stomach, and often your immediate fate, in their greasy, calloused, and occasionally glorious hands. Now that we've metaphorically swung through those iconic saloon doors, cautiously sniffed the air thick with stew fumes and stale beer, and perhaps even stared down a ghostly pickled egg floating ominously in its foggy jar, the real, pertinent question remains. Would you, a denizen of the modern world with your refined palate and 21st century hygiene standards, actually eat the food typically served at a Wild West saloon? Let's be brutally honest with ourselves. Our contemporary taste buds, accustomed to a universe of spices, fresh ingredients, and food safety regulations, might not merely struggle, they might outright revolt and declare mutiny. The beans were undeniably basic, often underseasoned and overboiled. The meat was, more often than not, a high-stakes gamble, its origin and freshness a constant source of uneasy speculation. And the stew? The stew was frequently more mystery than actual, identifiable meal. To even contemplate consuming such fare, you'd need teeth strong enough to tackle shoe leather, a stomach fortified with iron, and the kind of profound, all-encompassing appetite that only comes from riding 40 hard miles on a sunburnt horse with nothing but alkali dust in your lungs and a hollow ache in your belly. But here's the crucial, often overlooked thing. For the cowboys, miners, gamblers, soiled doves, and assorted misfits who populated the American frontier, saloon food wasn't about achieving gourmet flavor profiles or creating Instagram-worthy plating. It was about something far more fundamental. Fuel. It was about raw calories, about life-sustaining heat on a cold night, about the simple comfort of a warm plate between nerve-wracking gunfights, audacious train robberies, or yet another uncomfortable night spent sleeping in a drafty barn next to a mule named Regret. In short, it was about pure, unadulterated survival. You didn't politely inquire where the meat came from, because you probably didn't want to know the answer. You didn't lodge a complaint if the biscuit crumbled into chalky dust at the slightest touch. You just sat down, often at a splintered, sticky table, gratefully ate whatever was handed to you, and then promptly washed it all down with something potent enough to theoretically kill any lurking bacteria, or at the very least, strong enough to make you stop caring about their potential presence. And on those rare, almost miraculous occasions when the food was genuinely good, when the beans were freshly cooked and flavorful, when the coffee didn't actively try to bite you back, and when the cook had, in a moment of divine inspiration, spared a little extra molasses for the cornbread, it felt like nothing short of a miracle. A brief, shining moment of unexpected grace in a harsh and unforgiving world. So would you eat it? If you were transported back to that time and place, faced with the same stark choices and the same gnawing hunger, the answer is an unequivocal yes. You wouldn't just eat it. You'd be profoundly thankful for it. You'd scrape the bowl clean with a calloused finger, wipe the plate with the last crust of your bread, and probably order seconds if you had the coins. Coins that still smelled faintly of gunpowder, horse sweat, and distant dreams. You'd share a laugh with the strangers beside you, maybe curse the cook under your breath, but never to his face. Raise a toast with your cheap whiskey, and perhaps, just maybe, end the night with a surprisingly decent slice of pie and a story worth recounting for years to come. Because saloon food wasn't glamorous. It was gritty, it was greasy, and it was undeniably real. And in a world where the West was still truly, profoundly wild, that, in itself, was more than enough. Before your eyes even had a chance to adjust to the dim, smoky interior of a typical Wild West saloon, before you could even spot the poker game in the corner or the questionable piano player, another sense was violently accosted. The smell. It wasn't a welcoming aroma of roasting meats or baking bread. No, this was an olfactory assault. A complex, room-clearing bouquet that hit you like a physical force, a punch squarely in the nostrils. Imagine a potent cocktail, brewed from the unwashed bodies of men who'd spent weeks on the trail, their sweat mingling with the dust of a dozen territories. Add to that the sharp tang of stale beer, spilled and seeping into the wooden floorboards, creating a permanently sour note. Then layer in the acrid scent of wet, chewed tobacco, spat indiscriminately into ubiquitous spittoons, or often just onto the floor itself, joining the damp wood that formed the very structure of the place. A wood that had absorbed generations of spills, smoke, and desperation. And horses. Don't forget the horses. Their earthy, unbathed scent clung to their riders and drifted in from the hitching posts outside, a constant reminder of the animal power that drove this frontier world. If you were exceptionally lucky, if the wind was just right, you might, just might, detect the faintest, often deeply suspicious hint of something actually cooking in a back room or a lean-to kitchen. Some saloons, perhaps those with a sliver of ambition or a barkeep with a slightly more sensitive nose, tried to mask this miasma. Sawdust, liberally scattered across the floor, was a common tactic, ostensibly to soak up spills, but also, one imagines, to absorb some of the funk. Pipe smoke, thick enough to obscure faces and induce temporary amnesia, might also have offered a fleeting olfactory camouflage. Others, however, simply embraced the potent atmosphere. "You don't come here for the air," a grizzled barkeep might have grunted, swatting at flies with a rag that looked like it had witnessed and absorbed several major historical events without a wash. This was the environment, the very air you breathed, before you even thought about placing an order. It was a sensory initiation, a test of your commitment to sating your hunger in a place where hygiene was a rumor and fresh air a distant dream. Amidst this challenging aromatic landscape, one staple reigned supreme, the undisputed, unglamorous monarch of the saloon menu: beans. Yes, beans. Not because they were a culinary delight, but because they possessed qualities deeply valued on the frontier. They were cheap, virtually indestructible, and could be stretched to feed a crowd with minimal effort. Pinto beans, black beans, navy beans, the specific variety hardly mattered. If it was dried, vaguely bean-shaped, and could eventually be boiled into a semblance of edibility, it found its way into the communal pot. These humble legumes were the unsung heroes of countless saloon kitchens, served for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, often to men who hadn't seen a fresh vegetable since they waved goodbye to civilization weeks or months prior. The preparation, if one could call it that, was brutally simple. Step 1. Acquire beans. Step 2. Dump said beans into a large pot, often a cast iron cauldron that was never truly emptied, just perpetually topped up. Step 3. Add water, probably from the nearest well or creek, its purity a matter of hopeful speculation. Step 4. Boil and boil, and boil some more for hours on end over a smoky, often unreliable fire pit or a rickety stove, until the beans surrendered their inherent toughness and became a somewhat homogeneous mush. Seasoning? Salt, if you were lucky. Perhaps a chunk of salt pork tossed in for flavor and fat. Its presence more about preservation and calorie density than culinary finesse. Some more ambitious cooks, or those with access to slightly better provisions, might have added a chopped onion, a stray chili if one could be found, or even a splash of lard for richness. But for many, it was just beans and water, a testament to minimalist survival. They were hearty, they were filling, and they were predictable. 3 traits cowboys respected deeply. They fueled long cattle drives, powered late-night poker games, and gave you something to slowly chew on while you waited for the next bar fight to erupt, or for the piano player to finally learn a new DMN song. The only significant downside, apart from the sheer monotony, was the aftermath. One cowboy subsisting on beans was a manageable situation. A saloon packed with 10, 20, or more men, all powered by the same gaseous fuel, could become a biological hazard zone. It's whispered that some barroom brawls weren't ignited by insults over cards or women, but by a single, silent, but deadly olfactory betrayal committed too close to the communal stewpot. Legends even abound of beans being used as makeshift currency in dire straits. A man once supposedly bought a horse with a hefty sack of dried beans and a solemn promise to never return to that particular town, perhaps to spare the local atmosphere. So yes, beans were the baseline, the bedrock, the humble, often gassy heartbeat of 1,000 dusty meals. You didn't necessarily love them, but you respected their ability to keep you alive. And in the Wild West, respect often trumped affection. If beans formed the starchy foundation of saloon cuisine, then salt pork was its slightly greasier, undeniably tougher backbone. This wasn't the delicately cured, thinly sliced bacon you might imagine sizzling in a farmhouse kitchen. Oh no. This was a serious slab of meat and fat, typically pork belly, that had been so heavily salted and often smoked that it could arguably survive an apocalypse, a cross-country stampede, and 6 months forgotten in a saddlebag, without significant change to its core texture or alarming signs of decay. The sheer amount of salt used in its preservation could probably season a small ocean, and its primary purpose was to keep rot at bay, a critical feature in an era devoid of refrigeration. Its secondary effect, some argued, was to keep it from being genuinely enjoyable. Cooked with care, which was a rare event, salt pork could be tolerable, even bordering on satisfying. Fried up crisply in a searing hot skillet until the fat rendered and the edges became wonderfully crunchy, it offered a burst of salty, smoky flavor and a satisfying textural counterpoint that could make you briefly forget that the rest of your meal probably came from a can or had been simmering for 3 days. But cooked improperly, which was the unfortunate norm, it was an exercise in dental fortitude, akin to chewing on a salted boot heel that had been liberally dipped in axle grease. Despite its challenging nature, salt pork had its devoted, or perhaps simply resigned, fans. It was incredibly easy to transport, being relatively lightweight for its caloric punch and resistant to spoilage. It was also remarkably hard to ruin completely, though many saloon cooks certainly gave it their best shot. Even the blandest, most uninspired pot of beans could be elevated, or at least rendered more calorically significant, by the addition of diced salt pork, providing a salty punch of joy, or at the very least, a compelling reason to order another whiskey to wash it down. Waste was not an option in saloon kitchens. Every part of the salt pork was utilized. The rendered fat became the all-purpose cooking medium, used to fry everything from potatoes, if available, to biscuits, and even to grease the skillet for the next batch of questionable steak. The tough rind, often too leathery for human consumption, might be tossed into the stew pot for a hint of flavor, given to the ever-present saloon dogs, or, in a cruel prank, served to an unsuspecting newcomer who didn't know any better. One chewy, inedible bite, and they'd quickly learn that the barkeep wasn't joking when he advised, chew slow or choke proud. And yes, the pork itself could sometimes be suspicious, a faint greenish tinge here, a slightly off smell there. But in the demanding environment of a saloon, the prevailing culinary question wasn't, is this fresh? It was far more pragmatic. Did it kill the last fellow who ate it? If the answer was no, you generally gave it a try. Salt pork was nothing if not versatile. It could be diced and buried within a mountain of beans, slapped between two halves of a stale biscuit, fried up on its own as a protein-rich side, or gnawed at like a piece of tough jerky on long, lonely rides. Cowboys packed it like a precious treasure, and saloon cooks leaned on it heavily when fresh meat was scarce, when the chickens had mysteriously vanished, or when the stew pot was looking alarmingly thin. It was far from elegant, and it certainly wasn't a cardiologist's recommendation. But in a world where your next hot meal might be 60 hard miles away, salt pork, for all its faults, reliably got the job done. And if you managed to survive its regular consumption, well, you were undoubtedly stronger, or at least more resilient, for the experience. In the diverse and often desperate culinary landscape of the Wild West, stew was the great equalizer. It was hot, it was usually vaguely meaty, and it was almost always deeply, profoundly suspicious. This was the one dish that nearly every saloon, no matter how ramshackle its kitchen or questionable its hygiene standards, dared to serve. And why this universal adoption? Because stew was the perfect culinary cover story, a forgiving, amorphous concoction capable of absorbing whatever odds and ends the cook had managed to scrounge, find, or perhaps couldn't legally describe with any specificity. The base was deceptively simple: a large pot, a persistent fire, and a healthy dose of ambition, or perhaps just resignation. You started with water, then perhaps added some of those ever-present beans or a few hearty potatoes if they were on hand. And then, into this bubbling cauldron, you tossed whatever protein source hadn't managed to walk, crawl, or fly away on its own. Beef scraps from the local butcher? Certainly, if you were in a more upscale establishment. Rabbit snared from the nearby brush? Definitely a strong contender. Squirrel, if it held still long enough? Yep, into the pot it went. Rattlesnake? Well, if it wasn't actively biting anymore and someone was brave enough to skin it, its destiny was the stew. One particularly cynical traveler from the era once dryly claimed he found a bootstring in his bowl of saloon stew. He wasn't even particularly mad about it, remarking that it was, by far, the most chewable part of the entire serving. The quality of the meat, if one could generously call it that, varied wildly. Some stews in reputable establishments might actually feature tender, identifiable chunks of beef, perhaps sourced from a recent butchering. Others, well, they contained meat, the kind of generic, anonymous proteins that prompted polite diners not to ask too many questions. If the cook looked unusually nervous when serving, and the local dog population had seen a recent, unexplained decline, you learned to eat around the particularly chewy bits and offer a silent prayer for your continued digestive health. Vegetables, when they made an appearance, were usually subjected to such prolonged boiling that they surrendered all individual identity. Carrots became vague orange smudges, onions dissolved into the murky broth completely, and potatoes, while holding on the longest, eventually succumbed to a state of starchy disintegration. The end result was often a bubbling, brownish-gray slurry that surprisingly often smelled significantly better than it looked, and if you were lucky and it was seasoned with enough salt, might even taste better than you'd initially expect. Spices were a true luxury, a mark of a high-class joint. Most stews derived their primary kick from whatever residual flavors happened to be clinging to the cook's hands or the communal stirring knife. If you detected a hint of black pepper, you were dining in a veritable palace of gastronomy. If you got a noticeable dose of chili powder, congratulations, your sinuses were about to be forcibly cleared, and you were likely in a saloon with southwestern aspirations. But despite the mystery, the often unsettling texture, and the ever-present gamble, stew provided a strange form of comfort food for the weary cowboy. It was hot, which was a blessing on a cold night. It was undeniably filling, stretching to feed many from a single pot. And it could be endlessly extended by the simple addition of more water, reheated day after day until it developed the consistency, and some said the personality, of old, stubborn glue. You didn't eat saloon stew because it was a gourmet experience. You ate it because it was there, because it was warm, and because, frankly, nothing else in town was likely to be more edible, unless you had a particular fondness for chewing tobacco and a side of deep regret. The cardinal rule, universally understood, was simple. Never, ever ask what's in the stew. Because in the Wild West, ignorance wasn't just bliss. It was often the main ingredient in dinner. Not every cowboy, trail hand, or dusty prospector could afford the luxury of a steak, however questionable its quality. But nearly every saloon that served food had something bread-like on offer, something to soak up the gravy from the mystery stew or to provide a bit of ballast for the whiskey. That something usually manifested in one of two starkly contrasting forms. Either soft, flaky biscuits that when fresh were a taste of heaven, or the infamous hardtack, which was essentially bread's tougher, undead, and far more challenging cousin. Let's begin with the biscuits, the rarer and more celebrated of the two. When a saloon cook got them right, a magical confluence of skill, luck, and perhaps a decent batch of ingredients, they were a revelation. Imagine warm, buttery, flaky layers, light enough to melt in your mouth, convincing a man who'd been surviving on trail rations that he'd somehow stumbled into a proper, civilized kitchen. Cooks who could consistently produce good biscuits achieved local legendary status. Their names were whispered with reverence. Some claimed their secret was an abundance of lard. Others swore by the tang of buttermilk. A few, more pragmatically, probably just possessed lucky hands, a well-seasoned cast iron pan, and perhaps conveniently low standards for comparison. These prized biscuits were best enjoyed alongside a hearty serving of beans or stew. Their absorbent texture perfect for mopping up every last drop of broth that hadn't already burned your tongue. They were often made in those heavy cast iron pans, baked over open flames or in rudimentary ovens, and if the establishment was feeling particularly generous, served with a suspicious-looking chunk of butter, or for a touch of frontier fancy, a drizzle of molasses. And then there was hardtack. This was less a food item and more a survival tool, a dense, unforgiving slab of flour and water baked until it achieved a hardness capable of surviving nuclear winter, or at least a very long sea voyage. Originally conceived for soldiers and sailors due to its incredible shelf life, hardtack found its way west for one simple, compelling reason. It never, ever went bad. It also, by most accounts, barely qualified as food. Eating hardtack was not a casual affair. It required strategy and commitment. First, a cursory inspection for weevils was standard procedure. Their presence wasn't necessarily a deal breaker, merely an uninvited source of extra crunch and protein. Next, the crucial soaking stage. You'd submerge the hardtack in whatever liquid was available, stew broth, coffee, however dire, or even whiskey, until it began to soften. This process could take anywhere from 10 arduous minutes to what felt like 2 presidential terms. Even after a thorough soaking, chewing hardtack was a serious undertaking. You didn't just eat it, you grappled with it, engaged in a silent battle of wills between your jaw and its unyielding structure. Frontier dentists probably made a decent living off cowboys who boldly challenged a piece of hardtack and decisively lost. Yet, despite their vast differences, both biscuits and hardtack served their fundamental purpose. They were cheap, they were portable, though hardtack was decidedly more so, and they filled you up. In a world where sheer caloric intake often mattered far more than culinary artistry or sophisticated flavor profiles, that was more than enough. So if you strolled into a dusty, dimly lit saloon and caught the aroma of freshly baked biscuits, you counted your blessings and ordered quickly. If, however, they handed you a hardtack puck the approximate size and density of your palm, well, you sighed, prepared for a workout, and consoled yourself that at least it came with a story, and possibly a newly chipped tooth. If you believe your modern, artisanal, triple-filtered, ethically sourced coffee is strong, you've clearly never encountered true cowboy coffee. This was a brew so potent, so unapologetically robust, it didn't just wake you up. It stared back at you from the tin cup, issued a silent challenge, and dared you to blink. Coffee in the Wild West was less about nuanced flavor profiles, roasting origins, or delicate brewing methods, and more about raw, unadulterated survival. It wasn't lovingly ground from single-origin beans, filtered through fancy paper cones, or topped with aesthetically pleasing oat milk foam art. No, this was coffee in its most primal form. Grounds, often roughly crushed or sometimes not even ground at all, unceremoniously dumped into a kettle or pot with water and boiled with a vengeance until the resulting liquid turned ominously black and, some claimed, sentient. The standard recipe, if such a formal term can be applied, generally went something like this. Take water from whatever source was available, a creek, a well, a rain barrel, hopefully, one not too far downstream from where the horses did their business. Throw in a generous handful of coffee grounds, the quantity measured not by scoops or scales, but by pure instinct, aggression, and perhaps the number of miles ridden that day. Boil it hard, with a rolling, furious bubble. Don't strain it. Don't coddle it. Don't ask it nicely to behave. Just pour the resulting concoction into a tin cup and pray for your soul. The outcome was a thick, intensely dark liquid that often smelled like burnt dreams mixed with a hint of vengeance and tasted about the same. It wasn't uncommon for the final sip to contain a higher ratio of grounds to actual liquid, meaning that hardy cowboys received both their caffeine fix and a significant dose of dietary fiber in one heroic, gritty gulp. And yet, despite its often fearsome character, they loved it, or at least they depended on it fiercely. Coffee kept a man warm on bone-chillingly cold desert mornings. It kept him awake and alert through long, lonely night watches guarding the cattle. It valiantly attempted to mask the lingering effects of the previous night's questionable whiskey and aided, in its own aggressive way, in the digestion of equally questionable stew. It was fuel, it was comfort, it was punishment, and it was ritual, all condensed into one battered tin cup. Saloons didn't always serve coffee, especially those without a dedicated kitchen. But if they did, it usually emerged from the back boiling hot, probably several hours old and strong enough to strip paint from a barn door. One cowboy famously described it as like drinking a kick from a mule, but damn it, you miss it when it's gone. The truly fancy folk, those with a bit more coin or a sweeter tooth, might have added a precious spoonful of sugar or a splash of canned milk, if such luxuries were available. Everyone else just grimaced, endured, and powered through the experience. And if a saloon had been reheating the same pot of coffee throughout the entire day, adding more grounds and water as needed, you'd be treated to the boldest, most formidable brew known to mankind. A liquid as thick as tar, twice as resentful, and capable of etching itself into your memory and possibly your stomach lining for days to come. It's also worth noting the economical, if culinarily horrifying, practice of some cooks reusing old coffee grounds to stretch the pot further. This thrifty method inevitably led to a coffee that tasted primarily of disappointment, regret, and faintly of yesterday's despair, but it still counted as coffee. Because in the Wild West, you didn't drink coffee for the sheer pleasure of its taste. You drank it to feel alive, to stay alive, and to face whatever fresh hell the day might throw at you. In the rugged, often brutal landscape of the Wild West, meat wasn't just a food item. It was a form of currency, a clear indicator of status, and, on more than a few occasions, a veritable test of a man's bravery and his stomach's resilience. If your pockets were lined with enough coin and your luck was holding, you might swagger into a saloon and boldly order a steak. What you actually received, however, depended entirely on a precarious combination of blind luck, precise timing in relation to the last cattle drive or butcher's visit, and, some whispered, whether the cook held a deep-seated personal grudge against your particular face. Steak, in theory, represented a luxurious indulgence, a taste of prosperity. In stark reality, it was often a tough, gristly, and invariably overcooked slab of beef that had been unceremoniously fried in a pan laden with lard, scorched into grudging obedience, and served with exactly zero garnish. No sprig of parsley, no artful drizzle of sauce, just meat on a plate. If you were foolish enough to request it cooked medium rare, the cook would likely just fix you with a withering stare, silent and unblinking, until your mustache wilted under the pressure and you reconsidered your pretentious notions. When fresh beef wasn't available, and let's be brutally honest, in many remote saloons it usually wasn't, the establishments turned to a motley crew of other protein options. Dried jerky, a cowboy staple, might be offered, though it was more trail food than saloon fare. Salted buffalo meat, a relic of the once vast herds, could sometimes be found. Venison, if a local hunter had been successful, might grace the menu, or even wild boar if someone had gotten particularly lucky and skilled on a recent hunt. And by lucky, we generally mean they managed to bring down the animal and drag its carcass back to civilization before the buzzards laid claim to it. In isolated mining towns or far-flung frontier settlements, the definition of meat became considerably more creative. Squirrel stew, a dish that required a good aim and a strong stomach, was not unheard of. Rattlesnake roast, often marketed with a wink as prairie chicken, made an appearance. Roast jackrabbit, seasoned with whatever herbs could be foraged, was another common substitute. The unspoken rule was simple. If it had legs, or slithered, and didn't obviously belong to a paying customer's horse, it was considered fair game for the stew pot or the frying pan. Sometimes, a plate of anonymous meat would be set before you, and no one would volunteer its specific species. That was a clear, universally understood sign to eat quietly, chew thoroughly, and refrain from asking inconvenient questions. If you chewed for an unusually long time on a particular piece, or discovered something that suspiciously resembled a whisker, you simply took a slow sip of your whiskey, nodded solemnly at your plate, and silently accepted your culinary fate. There was also the ever-present risk of age. Some cuts of meat had been hanging around the back of the saloon, or perhaps in a poorly ventilated shed, long enough to develop distinct personalities, and perhaps even earn names from the kitchen staff. Enterprising cooks would deftly slice off the most obviously spoiled or discolored parts, attempt to drown the remainder in a thick, concealing gravy, and confidently inform you that it was well aged for enhanced flavor. If your plate seemed to twitch slightly when you poked it with your fork, you were generally entitled to one discreetly raised eyebrow and absolutely nothing more in terms of complaint. Still, on those rare, blessed occasions when the meat was genuinely fresh, perhaps from a recently butchered steer, and the cook wasn't too deep into his own supply of whiskey, you might actually receive a real, satisfying meal. A sizzling, generously sized slab of beef, perhaps with a fried egg perched jauntily on top, and maybe even a warm biscuit on the side. It was a plate of food that reminded you why people endured gunfights, blizzards, and stampedes for this life. But most of the time, you ate what was available, hoped it didn't harbor any immediate threats to your health, and prayed it wouldn't try to eat you back. In the utilitarian and often grim culinary world of a Wild West saloon, dessert wasn't really a formally recognized category on the menu. It was more of a delightful, unexpected, happy accident, usually the fortunate result of a cook finding themselves with a surplus of certain ingredients, and perhaps a fleeting moment of generosity, or a tiny, uncharacteristic sliver of mercy for their rough-and-tumble clientele. But if there was one reasonably reliable source of Swedish comfort, a humble yet satisfying treat that occasionally graced the saloon table, it was cornbread. Crafted from simple, readily available cornmeal, mixed with water or milk if a cow was nearby and cooperative. a dollop of lard for richness and texture, and sometimes, if the cook was feeling ambitious or actually remembered, a dash of baking powder for a bit of lift. Cornbread was the Swiss Army knife of the frontier menu. It possessed a remarkable versatility. It could be baked in pans over an open fire or in a rudimentary oven, fried in skillets until golden and crispy, or even in moments of extreme haste or profound laziness, dropped by spoonfuls directly into boiling stew to create makeshift dumplings. Eaten on its own, cornbread was often a rather dry, crumbly affair, its sweetness varying wildly depending on the recipe, or lack thereof, and the hand that made it. It was invariably at its best when served fresh from the oven or skillet, still warm and fragrant. Unfortunately, fresh was a state it rarely maintained for long. More often than not, you'd be presented with a wedge of cornbread that had been sitting near the stove since sunrise, slowly hardening until it achieved a density and resilience comparable to a seasoned gold miner's conscience. But here's where the true magic, the frontier alchemy, often happened. Molasses. This dark, sticky, intensely sweet, and syrupy miracle was the saving grace of many a dry baked good. It had the power to transform a wedge of otherwise uninspiring day-old cornbread into something just shy of glorious, a genuine treat for a palate accustomed to beans and salt pork. Molasses was the cowboy's frosting, the outlaw's indulgent drizzle, the lonely gambler's last small bit of sugary joy before he inevitably lost everything on a disastrously bad hand of cards. It was relatively affordable, it kept remarkably well in the fluctuating temperatures of the West, and its potent sweetness was adept at masking a multitude of culinary sins, including the profound dryness of even the most neglected cornbread. If a saloon boasted a barrel of molasses in its storeroom, you considered yourself in luck. If they went the extra mile and actually warmed the molasses before serving it over your cornbread, you were practically dining at a five-star establishment by the rustic standards of the frontier. Some more enterprising cooks even took it a step further, generously pouring warmed molasses over skillet-fried cornbread and perhaps tossing in a daring pinch of salt or a hint of spice to create a more complex flavor profile. It wasn't quite cake, not by a long shot, but it certainly felt like a luxurious indulgence if you'd been subsisting on a diet of beef jerky and hardtack for the better part of a week. Cornbread, generously anointed with molasses, thus became the default dessert of the Wild West saloon. It was quick to prepare, relatively cheap, undeniably filling, and just sweet enough to calm your nerves after a particularly rough ride, a near miss in a gunfight, or a tense, exhausting session at the poker table. There was no fancy icing, no whipped cream, no delicate frills, just honest grit, wholesome grain, and a deeply satisfying, gooey sweetness. And for many a weary soul on the frontier, that simple pleasure was more than enough. Because when your daily life routinely involved cattle drives through dust storms, the constant threat of bandits, and the occasional, nerve-wracking shootout, your dessert didn't need to sparkle with sophistication. It just needed to be a comforting, sweet reminder that not everything in the vast, untamed West was actively trying to kill you. And so, our journey into the past draws to a close for tonight. Let the echoes of history soften now, gently fading away. Come back fully to the quiet comfort of your own space, your own bed. Feel the stillness around you, safe and calm. There's nothing more needed now but rest. Allow yourself to drift peacefully into sleep. Good night.